Gideon Rusk didn't say a word when he gave the order. He just nodded once, a small, cold nod, and his men broke camp in silence, while Maren was still a mile out on the ridge, scouting the trail he'd sent her down alone. By the time she walked back into the clearing, every horse was gone. Every pack, every rifle, every scrap of food, her wool coat, her blanket roll, the $11 she hadn't hidden well enough. Gone. He left her there to die, not in anger, not in fear. He left her because he looked at a 22-year-old plus-size woman with no family and no money and decided the mountains would do the work for him and nobody would ever ask questions. He was wrong about almost everything. If you've ever been underestimated, truly written off, stay with me. Subscribe right now and hit that notification bell so you never miss a story like this one. And drop your city and country in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's go back to where it started. The morning Maren Hollowell walked into Ash Creek, she had blisters on both heels, a wool coat that belonged to a dead woman, and $11 folded so many times the paper had gone soft as cloth, tucked inside her left boot against her arch, where she could feel it with every step. She wasn't trying to feel it for comfort. She was feeling it to make sure it was still there. Ash Creek wasn't much a string of buildings along a wide dirt road, a general store with a warped porch, a livery that smelled like old manure even from 50 yards out, a saloon that opened before noon, and a land office that may or may not have been staffed on any given day. The kind of town that existed because it had to, not because anyone particularly wanted it there. Maren had arrived on a borrowed wagon seat, sitting beside a rancher named Orville, who'd given her a ride from the Callaway Road junction because she'd helped him pull a rear wheel out of a creek crossing without being asked. He didn't talk much. She didn't either. He dropped her off in front of the general store and said, "Good luck to you," the way people say things they don't expect to matter. She stood on the porch a moment and looked at the street. She had no job, no contacts, no family name that meant anything in this territory. The homestead she'd grown up on, the one her grandfather Silas had built and worked and loved, had been taken from her by a cousin. Twice removed, she'd met exactly twice. A man who'd produced paperwork she hadn't known existed, and a county judge who apparently had no trouble sleeping afterward. That had been 41 days ago. Since then, she'd done 2 weeks of kitchen work at a roadhouse, 1 week of mending at a widow's house outside of Terrence, and 11 days of nothing at all, eating sparingly, walking more than she should, and arriving in Ash Creek with the kind of fatigue that settles into your bones and makes you feel older than you are. She was 22. She pushed open the door to the general store. The man behind the counter, a short bald fellow with a wax mustache, and the permanent squint of someone who spent too much time adding columns, looked up at her and then looked back down at his ledger without speaking. Not hostile, just uninterested. She was not a customer who looked like she'd be buying much. She asked if he knew of anyone needing work. He turned a page. "Harvest season's over," he said. "Kitchen work dried up 2 weeks ago. Laundry woman over on Pell Street might need help, but she's picky." He paused. "You got experience with anything specific?" "Tracking, camp cooking, pack animals, guiding back country." That made him look up. He studied her for a moment, the heavy build, the worn coat, the blistered confidence in the way she stood, and she could see exactly what he was thinking, because people had been thinking it her whole life. She'd stopped being embarrassed by it somewhere around age 15. Now she just waited. "There's a party of hunters at the Dellard Hotel," he said finally. 4 men out of Philadelphia, looking to hire a local guide for a mountain hunt. Been asking around 2 days. Their last candidate fell off a horse and broke his wrist. "What are they paying?" "Don't know, you'd have to ask Rusk. He's the one running it." She thanked him and left without buying anything, which she could tell relieved him. The Dellard Hotel was the nicest building in Ash Creek, which meant it had a second floor and curtains in the windows that had been washed inside the last year. Maren found Gideon Rusk in the dining room, which was empty at that hour, except for him and one of his companions, a thick-necked man named Caldwell, who seemed to serve the function of a wall present, solid and not given to speech. Rusk was perhaps 45, with the kind of lean, expensive look that came from being thin in a way that cost money good boots, a jacket cut by someone who knew what they were doing, a hat that hadn't been bought off a shelf. He had pale gray eyes that moved over a room quickly, assessing, cataloging. the eyes of a man who was always deciding what things were worth. He looked at Maren the way the general store man had looked at her, but with less indifference and more deliberate appraisal. Like he was not merely uninterested, but was actively forming a conclusion. She introduced herself before he could speak. I heard you need a guide for mountain country. I know the terrain east and northeast of here from childhood. I can track pack animals, read weather, and I know how to keep a hunting party fed in the backcountry when supply runs short. My grandfather was Silas Hollowell. He scouted this range before most of the current maps were drawn. Rusk leaned back in his chair. Caldwell, across the table, looked at the ceiling. You're Hollowell's granddaughter, Rusk said. Not a question. More like he was testing the taste of it. I am. Silas Hollowell's been dead. What, 2 years now? 14 months. He picked up his coffee cup, found it empty, set it back down. How old are you? 22. And you've guided parties before? I've worked alongside guides since I was 8 years old. I've led smaller parties on my own for the last 4 years. I know the eastern drainage up to the ridgeline, and I know which routes are passable this time of year for horses carrying full pack weight. Rusk was quiet for a moment. He glanced at Caldwell, who was still looking at the ceiling, but something passed between them, some small communication that Maren had learned to recognize and had also learned not to let on to that she recognized. We're heading into difficult country, Rusk said. The terrain gets rough above 5,000 feet. It requires someone who can set pace, manage the animals, and keep up over long distances. He let that sit there. Maren let it sit there too, for a moment, and then she said, I understand what you're suggesting. I'd suggest you judge my ability by my work rather than my appearance. Most people who've made that mistake in the field have regretted it. Rusk smiled, and the smile didn't reach his pale eyes at all. Fair enough. $4 for the full trip. We leave day after tomorrow. $4. She'd hoped for 6, maybe 7, but $4 and the job meant food and a roof for 2 days and money in hand at the end and possibly more work after if she did well. Done, she said. She didn't shake his hand. He didn't offer it. She spent those 2 days learning everything she could. She talked to the livery man about the 4 horses Rusk had rented and which ones had strong feet and which one had a tendency to short step on loose ground. She bought 2 pounds of dried meat, a small tin of salt, and a length of cord from the general store. The total came to 63 cents, and she walked as I'm first out of town to where it met the first line of timber and stood there for a while, watching the sky over the peaks and reading what it told her. What it told her was cold coming, maybe snow at elevation within 10 days, but a clear window of 6 or 7 days first. She had guided in worse. She also asked quiet questions about Rusk. What she learned was not exactly alarming, but it had edges. He'd brought a hunting party through the territory twice before, both times with a different guide. One of those guides, a man named Fentress, had apparently come back from the second trip with the story that didn't add up, something about supply discrepancies and a disagreement over payment, and had left Ash Creek not long afterward. Nobody knew where Fentress had gone. The people Maren talked to didn't seem to find this especially remarkable. Men came and went. Maren filed it away. She didn't leave. She needed the $4. The first 2 days on the trail went well enough. Rusk's party consisted of himself, Caldwell, and 2 other men named Pruitt and Sherrard. Pruitt was soft and amiable, the kind of man who apologized when his horse bumped another horse and meant it genuinely. Sherrard was younger, late 20s, sharp-featured, nervous in the way of someone waiting for something to happen. He watched Maren more than the others did, and not in any way she could read cleanly. She set a pace that was firm but not punishing. She knew her body's language by now, knew where it was efficient and where it cost her, and she'd long since stopped trying to look effortless on steep grade. She simply climbed, steady and relentless. And by the end of the second afternoon, the 4 men were breathing harder than she was, and nobody said anything about keeping up anymore. They camped the first night in a hollow near a creek she knew ran cold and clean. She showed Pruitt how to string the food pack high enough to discourage bears. She checked the horses herself, running hands down their legs in the last of the light. The one the livery man had warned her about a roan with a rough left rear was favoring it already. She adjusted its pack load and redistributed the weight without being asked. Rusk watched her do it. She could feel his eyes. You know what you're doing, he said, not warmly, more like he was updating a ledger. Yes, she said. I do. The third day brought them above the timberline onto open country, and this was where Maren's knowledge separated itself from anything a casual guide could offer. She found the switchback that cut 40 minutes off the eastern approach. She read a shelf cloud building over the northwestern peak and moved the party across an exposed stretch before it dropped weather on them. She called a rest stop at a particular flat rock that turned out to sit directly above a seep spring clean, cold water emerging from the base of a granite outcropping which she'd known was there because Silas had shown it to her when she was 11 years old, standing exactly where she was standing now. How did you know about that? Sherrard asked, filling his canteen. My grandfather. He must have known every inch of this range. He tried to, she said. That night, Rusk asked her to describe the best route into the upper basin where he expected to find elk, and she drew it in the dirt beside the fire, with a stick the route, the altitude markers she used by memory, the 2 spots where elk had watered in previous years, the deadfall that had blocked the northern approach but could be bypassed left. She felt that night something close to usefulness, something close to being herself. She didn't notice Rusk and Sherrard exchange a look across the fire. She was watching the coals. The 4th morning, Rusk sent her east along the ridge alone. I want to know what's beyond that ridgeline, he said. Whether the ground drops into a drainage or plateaus out. Can you do that and be back by afternoon? It was a reasonable scouting request. She'd done a dozen like it with Silas. Yes, she said. I'll be back by midday. She took her canteen, her knife, and her rifle and went. The ridge walk took longer than expected. The ground was rougher than it appeared from below, broken and loose, and she had to pick her way carefully across a long shale slope that wanted to slide. But she reached the crest and saw what was below, a long drainage running northeast, timbered, with what looked like a creek thread at the bottom, an open meadow beyond it. Good country, elk country likely. She was back at the camp clearing by early afternoon, maybe an hour past midday. The camp was gone, not abandoned in a hurry, gone clean. Every horse, every pack, every tent. The fire pit raked smooth. The ground where the tents had stood was empty and settling back into itself. Its windows were dark. She stood at the edge of the clearing and understood what had happened the way you understand something when the evidence is complete and requires no interpretation. They had planned this from the morning. The scouting errand was a disposal. Get the guide far enough away. Break camp, move fast south on a route she'd shown them, and be down the mountain before she could cover the distance on foot. Her rifle, her pack, her extra food, her bedroll, her wool coat. She was standing above 8,000 feet with a canteen, a knife, and the clothes on her back, and the temperature would drop 30 degrees after dark. She stood there for a long moment, very still. Then she reached down and unlaced her left boot, ran her fingers along the inside of the arch until she felt the folded paper. $11. She laced the boot back up, stood, looked east away from the direction Rusk had gone, and started walking. Not because it was the safe choice, because it was the right one. And because Silas Hollowell had not raised her to chase the men who wronged her. He'd raised her to outlast them. She walked east because that was the only direction that made any sense to her, not emotionally, not in some desperate, panicked way, but practically. South was Rusk's route, and she had no horse and no supplies and no chance of catching 4 mounted men before they hit the lower trail. North was exposed ridge with no shelter and nothing she knew beyond it. West meant retracing the full approach through open country with night coming fast. East was the direction she half remembered from a single trip with Silas when she was 9 years old, maybe 10. She wasn't certain of the memory. It had the soft edges of something recalled from childhood, unreliable, potentially useless. Silas had taken her on a long loop through the upper drainage east of the main range, following a creek that bent twice before it reached a narrow canyon mouth. She remembered the creek more than the route. She remembered the sound of it, specifically the way it ran fast over flat rock and made a particular low roar that changed pitch when the canyon walls closed in. Whether she could find it again from above, on foot, with no map and fading light, that was a different question entirely. She gave herself the first mile to be scared. That was something Silas had told her, once when she was 13, and they'd gotten turned around in a November fog on the western's drainage, and she'd started crying and couldn't stop. He'd put his hand on her shoulder, not unkindly, and said, You get a mile to be scared. Then you work. She hadn't understood it fully then. She understood it now. The fear was real. Her hands were cold already. The temperature, dropping as afternoon, thinned into early evening, and what she was looking at in terms of immediate survival problems was exposure, dehydration by tomorrow, hunger after that, but fear was information, not instruction. She let it tell her what she was dealing with, and then she set it aside in the part of her mind where it wouldn't get in the way of thinking. She moved carefully on the shale slope she'd crossed that morning, taking it diagonal and slow, testing each step before committing weight. Her boots were not ideal. They'd been decent enough for the trail, but they were not proper mountain boots, and the left one had a seam starting to separate near the toe that she'd been meaning to have resoled before the trip. She felt it now with every flex. She noted it and kept moving. Below the shale, the ground changed to broken granite shelves that stepped down in rough tiers. She used her hands on the steeper sections, the cold of the rock pulling at her fingers. Her heavy coat Rusk's men had taken it with everything else had been wool, warm enough for the temperature swings at elevation. What she had on was a flannel shirt over a cotton undershirt and canvas work trousers that had been washed enough times to be soft but not thick. It was adequate for movement. It was not adequate for stopping. So she kept moving. She found the first creek about 40 minutes before dark, but it wasn't the right one. It ran wrong too small, running south when she needed east. She followed it downstream for a quarter mile, checking the ground on both banks, looking for the kind of sign that told you where water went next, the way the land folded, where the vegetation thickened, whether there was a second channel sound underneath the first. There was nothing that matched what she remembered. She left it and climbed a short rise to see the country better in the last light. From the top she could see 3 drainages running off the eastern face of the range, each one a darker crease in the gray-blue of the mountain slope in fading light. The middle one looked wider. It looked like it bent. She went toward it. The dark came faster than she'd planned for. By the time she was moving down into the second drainage, she was navigating more by feel than sight the ground underfoot. The sound of the creek she could now hear running ahead and to the left, the slope angle changing under her boots. She was walking with her hands slightly out for balance, and she was aware that a turned ankle out here would end the conversation immediately and permanently. She slowed down. She hated slowing down, but she slowed down. The creek, when she reached it, was cold enough that touching it sent an ache up her wrist. She drank from her cupped hands. The canteen was already empty, and the water was clean and hard and tasted like granite and snowmelt, and she drank more than she meant to because her throat was dry and her body wanted it badly. She made herself stop, straightened up, and listened. Creek was running east, and there, just audible under the primary current sound, was the change in pitch water hitting flat rock and altering its voice in a particular way that she had heard before. She'd been 9 years old, maybe 10, and the sound was the same. She followed the creek. She didn't find the canyon mouth that night. What she found, 2 hours into the dark, was a drive overhang and a granite face along the creek bank, not a cave. More like a shelf of rock that jutted out far enough to create a space 3 feet high and maybe 8 feet deep, where the ground underneath was dry, and the wind, which had picked up sharply in the last hour, didn't reach. She crawled in, pulled her knees to her chest, tucked her hands under her arms, and stayed there. She did not sleep deeply. She dozed in short intervals and woke shivering and moved her legs and arms to generate heat and dozed again. At some point in the middle of the night, the wind dropped, and temperature stabilized, and she slept for what felt like a longer stretch, though she couldn't be sure. She woke to a sky that had gone from black to the particular gray that preceded dawn by about an hour. Everything hurt. Her hips, her shoulders, the base of her spine. Her hands were stiff and slow. The seam on her left boot had separated another half-inch. She sat with her back against the granite shelf and gave herself a minute to take inventory of how she actually was, which was Silas's practice, not how she felt emotionally, but physically, factually. Fingers functioning, though cold. Feet intact. No injury from the previous day's walking beyond general soreness and the boot situation. Caloric deficit starting, but not yet affecting function. Hydration acceptable from the creek. Temperature survivable if she kept moving. She was in better shape than the mountain wanted her to be. She drank from the creek, splashed water on her face, until the cold shock cleared her head, and started walking. The canyon mouth appeared in the full morning light, and she recognized it. Not with the clean certainty of a landmark from a map, more like the recognition you feel when you hear a song you haven't heard in 15 years and realize you know every word. The canyon walls were sandstone layered with granite intrusion, and they closed in to maybe 30 feet across at the narrowest, and the creek ran straight through the center over flat shelving rock that made a specific sound. She stopped walking and stood there in the canyon entrance with water running over her boots, and she felt some shift in her chest that was not quite hope, but was adjacent to it. Silas had stopped here too, she remembered. They'd eaten lunch, sitting on the flat rocks with their boots off, and he'd said something about the country east of here being unknown to him, that he'd come this far twice and never gone further, because the canyon looked like it dead-ended. But it didn't, he'd told her. He'd confirmed later from his own maps that there was a ravine system beyond the canyon, uncharted, possibly never formally surveyed. She'd been 9 or 10, and the word uncharted had meant adventure to her. Now it meant something different. Now it meant nobody would come looking. She went through the canyon. The canyon was perhaps a quarter-mile long, and the footing was uncertain, wet rocks, some moss, the creek running sometimes ankle-deep across the full floor of it. She went slowly. The walls closed the sky to a narrow strip overhead. At the far end, the canyon opened into a wide bowl of country that stopped her completely. She stood at the canyon's eastern exit and looked at what was there. A ravine, a genuine ravine, not just a drainage, but a deep natural cut in the landscape, running north to south with steep timbered walls on both sides and a flat bottom perhaps 200 yards wide. The creek continued into it from the canyon. The vegetation was thick and healthy aspen along the creek, pine on the walls, a meadow of dried late-season grass in the flat bottom. At the southern end of the flat, maybe 300 yards from where she stood, there was a structure. Not ruins. A structure. Log walls, standing with what appeared to be a roof partially intact. She walked toward it without making a decision to do so. Her legs just went. The cabin was small, one room, perhaps 18 by 20 feet, and it was in rough condition but had not collapsed. The logs were old and had gone gray, and some had shifted in their notches, leaving gaps at the corners that let daylight through. The door was a heavy plank affair, hanging at an angle from 2 leather hinges, one of which had dried and cracked but not fully given way. The roof was split shingles over rough-cut rafters, and several shingles had lifted and let weather in, but the main structure was sound. She pulled the door open. It dragged on the earthen floor. Inside, a cast-iron stove against the north wall. A table, planks on sawbuck legs, uneven but intact. A sleeping platform built into the east wall boards on wooden pegs driven into the log wall, the ticking on it rotted to nothing but the boards themselves solid. 2 wooden pegs on the wall near the door. A wooden crate in the corner containing a rusted tin cup, a length of rope, still serviceable, a splitting wedge, and a small canvas bag that had been eaten into by something but still held 3 wooden matches in a wax paper wrapper at the bottom. 3 matches. She sat down on the edge of the sleeping platform and looked at the 3 matches and waxed the wax paper for a long time. Then she got up and went to work. She started with the stove because warmth was the immediate priority. The stovepipe was intact. She could see light at the top when she looked up through it, and the firebox was dry inside, which meant the pipe draw was probably functional. She went out and found wood. Not good wood, what was within easy reach was weathered deadfall, some of it punky, but there were 2 birch logs near the creek bank that had fallen recently enough to still have solid cores. She used Silas's knife, his knife, the bone-handled folding knife that had been on her belt when Rusk's men took everything else, because they hadn't thought a folding knife was worth the bother of taking to shave tinder from the driest section of one of the birch logs. She built the fire the way Silas had shown her in wet season, when everything was damp, tinder first, tight and layered, then pencil-thin splits, then finger-thick wood, then the larger pieces once the fire had committed. She used the first match. The tinder caught and held. She sat back on her heels and watched the small flame move into the larger structure and take hold, and the warmth that came off the stove as it heated was physical and immediate, and she pressed her hands close to it and felt the stiffness in her fingers loosen degree by degree. She needed to think, and she could think better warm. The cabin was abandoned, but not disused in the random way of a place that had simply been walked away from. There was an intentionality to it, the rope coiled rather than left tangled, the tin cup placed rather than dropped, the matches wrapped in wax paper against moisture. Someone had left this place with care. Someone had expected on some level to come back, or had prepared it as if someone else might. She looked around the room again, more carefully this time. On the table, she'd initially noticed only the surface boards, uneven, weathered. But there was something on the underside of the tabletop. She could see now from the angle of light through the doorboards nailed upward across the underside of the main planks, creating a rough shelf or compartment beneath the table surface. She knelt and looked. A flat wooden box, fitted into the space and held by two wooden pegs through the table legs. She worked it free with her knife. Inside the box was a journal. The cover was dark brown leather, cracked at the spine, the closure strap stiff but still attached. She carried it to the stove and opened it in the better light. The handwriting inside was clear and small, and practiced the handwriting of a man who had written a great deal over a long life. The name on the first page was Amos Reddick, and below it a year that put the first entry roughly 30 years in the past. She didn't read it immediately. She set it carefully on the table, went out and gathered more wood 3 trips, stacking it against the inside wall away from the stove, and then she sat on the sleeping platform with the journal and started from the beginning, moving her lips slightly as she read the way she'd always done when something required real attention. Amos Reddick had been an army clerk. She understood within the first 20 pages. He'd mustered out after some kind of dispute with his commanding officer. The account was careful and oblique about specifics. But the anger underneath the careful language was real, and he'd come into this territory with the intention of trapping and had found the ravine in what he called his second autumn in the mountains. He'd built the cabin himself over the course of 2 seasons. He described the process in the kind of specific detail that suggested he was proud of it, which logs he'd chosen, how he'd cut the shingles, why he'd positioned the door south-facing to catch morning light. The man wrote the way lonely people write in full, as if to an audience, because the journal was the audience. He wrote about weather at length. He wrote about animals he'd watched from the cabin. He wrote about what he cooked and what he couldn't cook, because certain supplies ran short. He wrote occasionally about his former life in terms that were bitter and selective and never quite fully explained. Maren read for an hour while the stove threw heat into the small room, and the temperature inside the cabin went from survivable to almost comfortable. Then she turned a page and stopped. Amos had come into some money. Not earned money, not trapped money. He wrote about it with the same careful obliqueness he used for the army dispute, but the shape of it was clear enough across several entries spread over what appeared to be a period of weeks. He had in his time as an army clerk had custody of a fund military in origin, designated for a payroll disbursement that had, due to circumstances involving the end of a campaign and a rapid troop redeployment, never been completed. The monies had sat in a strong box in a depot that was subsequently abandoned. Amos had been the last clerk with access to it. He'd made a decision that he described in the journal without apology, but also without celebration. He'd taken it. Not all of it, he'd been very specific about that, but the portion he could carry. He'd justified it to himself, on the grounds that the army had no further use for it, that the men it had been intended for had long since moved on, and that he had, in his assessment, been cheated out of a decade of honest service by an officer who'd used Amos's careful work to advance his own career and then discarded him. Whether that justified it, Maren didn't have an opinion about it, sitting there in the firelight. It had happened 30 years ago, and everyone involved was likely dead. She kept reading. Later entries written over several years in a hand that had gradually changed, grown slightly less steady, described Amos adding to the cash. Trapping earnings, primarily. Small amounts over time that accumulated. He'd had no family, no heirs, no particular attachment to the idea of the money surviving him. But he was also, it became clear as Maren read, a man of organized habit, who could not simply leave things unaccounted for. So he'd inventoried everything, and he'd put it somewhere deliberate. She turned to the last third of the journal. The final entry was not dated. It was written in a different handshake year, the letters larger, the pressure on the page lighter, as if the writer had less strength than usual. Amos wrote that he was not well. He wrote that the winter had been harder than previous winters and that he'd been sick since November and was not improving. He wrote that he hoped whoever found the cabin would be someone decent, someone in genuine need, because in his experience, genuine need and genuine character often came together in ways that comfort prevented. He wrote that he'd left what he had for such person. He wrote that he was sorry he didn't know who that would be. He wrote, "The stone hearth holds the rest of it. Use the knife to work the mortar at the northeast corner. It'll come loose without much effort. I designed it that way." Maren looked at the stone hearth. Then she looked at Silas's knife in her hand. She stood up slowly. Her legs were stiff from sitting, and the floor was uneven, and she crossed it in 4 careful steps. The hearth was fieldstone, mortared, perhaps 4 feet wide and 3 feet high. The northeast corner she oriented herself. The door was south, so north was the back wall, east was the right, was the upper right. She crouched and looked at the mortar there. It looked like the other mortar. She pressed the tip of the knife blade against it and pushed. It moved, not crumbled, moved, gave inward slightly the way a fitted piece moves rather than the way old mortar crumbles. She worked the knife around the edges of a section perhaps 12 inches square. And the mortar there was not mortar. At all, it was a compound that had been mixed to look like mortar, but had not been applied to set hard. She worked the edge free in pieces, and behind it was a fitted stone facing, and behind that. She reached in. Her hand closed on the edge of something wooden, a box. She worked it forward carefully, and it came free, and she set it on the hearth and opened the latch. Inside, coins, gold and silver both, more than she could count quickly. Paper currency, older bills, some federal, some territorial, bundled with a strip of leather. A folded document that appeared to be a military payroll register. Another document in legal language she couldn't fully parse by firelight. And in the corner of the box, small and separate from the currency, wrapped in a piece of oilcloth, a brass compass. She unwrapped it. It was worn smooth with handling, the brass gone to a deep amber patina that came from decades of being in a pocket against a body. She turned it over in her fingers. The hinge was stiff but functional. She opened the cover, and looked at the face, the needle settling north after a moment, and then she looked at the back. There were initials engraved there, small and careful, S.H. She went very still. Her grandfather's name had been Silas Hollowell. He'd had a compass, a brass one, worn, that he'd carried for years. She'd asked him about it once, when she was maybe 7, and he'd said he'd lent it to a friend for an expedition and never gotten it back. He'd said it without much feeling, as if it were a small thing, but she'd seen his face when he looked at the empty pocket where he used to keep it. She turned the compass over again, S.H. The fire in the stove was making a low, even sound. Creek outside was running. The light through the door was the afternoon light of a mountain day, clear and flat and honest. She'd sat down on the floor of Amos Reddick's cabin with Amos Reddick's box of gold and silver in front of her and her grandfather's brass compass in her hands, and she tried to work out how those two facts could exist in the same place at the same time, and what it meant that she, of all people, had walked through that canyon and found them. She didn't arrive at a clean answer. She wasn't sure there was one. What she knew was this: she was alive. She was warm. She had more money in front of her than she'd seen in her life, combined. And she was sitting in a place that nobody knew existed, in a ravine that appeared on no map she'd ever seen. The people who'd put her here, who'd stripped her of her coat and her supplies and her rifle and left her above 8,000 feet to sort out her own death, thought they'd been clever about it. Thought they'd found the one category of person the territory would not mourn or search for, a homeless, overweight young woman with no family name that carried weight and no patron who'd ask questions. She turned the brass compass over once more in her hands. Then she set it down carefully next to Silas's knife on the edge of the hearth, and she started thinking, not frantically, not with the jagged desperation of someone who'd been surviving on instinct for 2 days, but steadily and carefully, the way Silas had taught her to plan before she moved about exactly what she was going to do next. She had time. She was not being chased. She was not being searched for. As far as Gideon Rusk was concerned, she was already solved. She was beginning to understand a significant tactical error on his part. She went out and gathered more wood. She checked the door hinge and determined it could be remounted with the hardware she found in the crate and a smaller piece of hide rope. She found a gap in the north wall wide enough to put her hand through and packed it with a clay-heavy soil from the creek bank that, once it dried, would hold against wind. She inventoried the rope 30 feet, hemp, stiff but not rotted, entirely serviceable. She tested the sleeping platform and found 2 of the support pegs had worked loose and drove them back with a piece of firewood used as a mallet. None of it was elegant. All of it was necessary. By the time she finished, the light was going, and she had a fire in the stove that would last the night on the wood she'd stacked inside. She ate nothing because there was nothing to eat, and she was accustomed enough hunger by this point to know that one more night without food was uncomfortable but not dangerous. She lay on the bare board sleeping platform with her hands under her head and looked at the firelight moving on the ceiling. She thought about Rusk, not with hatred, because hatred was expensive, and she didn't have the budget for it, but with something colder than hatred, a kind of careful clarity. He had made a calculation about her. The calculation had seemed reasonable, probably from his position. She was without resources or connections or protection. She was easy to dismiss and easy to discard. He'd done both. But here was what Rusk had failed to account for. The dismissal itself was the thing that had left her here, in the one place she needed to be. If he'd simply cheated her on the payment and sent her back to Ash Creek, she'd have been $4 poorer and no better off than before. Instead, he'd put her in the mountains alone, and the mountains the one territory in the world where what she carried inside her, the knowledge, the patience, the capacity to make decisions under pressure without falling apart, was worth more than anything he could have taken from her. In that cleared camp, he had, in trying to destroy her, delivered her exactly to the right place. She closed her eyes. She didn't fully understand yet everything that brass compass meant, the connection between Silas and Amos Reddick, what expedition they might have shared, how a man who'd lived alone in an unmapped ravine for 30 years had come to preserve her grandfather's compass, alongside everything else he'd left behind. That was a question for the journal, and she'd need better light and more time to find the answer in it. But she understood one thing with complete certainty, lying there on the board platform in Amos Reddick's cabin, while the stove ticked and the creek ran outside. She was not leaving this place the way she'd arrived in it, with $11 and a borrowed coat and no claim on any piece of the earth. She was not going to take a handful of coins and walk out and let this ravine go back to being unknown. She was going to claim it. The thought settled into her with the same steadiness the warmth had, not sudden, not dramatic, but real and thorough and permanent. Outside, the mountain was dark and cold and indifferent to all of it. Inside, the fire was going. She woke before dawn with her jaw aching from clenching it in her sleep and her left hip bruised from the board platform, and for a moment, just a moment, she didn't know where she was. Then the smell of ash and cold pine came in, and she remembered everything at once and sat up. The fire in the stove had burned down to coals, still alive barely. She fed it 2 pieces of wood and waited until it caught before she stood up fully, because her knees were stiff and the floor was uneven, and she'd learned in the night exactly which boards had soft spots. She moved around them now without thinking about it, the way you learn a room faster when you're alone in it and have to. Her first thought, fully awake, was water. Her second was food. Her third was the journal. She drank from the creek with the tin cup she'd cleaned with creek sand the night before, and she was hungry enough that her stomach had gone past complaining into a kind of focused silence that she recognized as the body conserving itself. She'd gone longer without food. Twice. Actually once, when she and Silas had gotten pinned down 3 days by a late storm on the western face. And once during the first 2 weeks after losing the homestead, when the money had run out before the next job came through. She knew what hunger felt like when it was still manageable, and she knew what it felt like when it wasn't, and she was still in the manageable category, though the margin was shrinking. She needed to address the food problem today, not tomorrow. Today, she went back inside, sat at the table in the morning light coming through the door, and opened Amos Reddick's journal to where she'd left off the night before. She was looking for 2 things, anything about the surrounding terrain that would tell her where to find game or edible plant material, and anything that explained the connection between Amos and Silas Hollowell. She found the food information first. Amos had written extensively about what the ravine provided creek trout that ran well in spring and early fall, grouse in the timber on the east wall, rabbit runs along the meadow's northern edge, where the grass met the aspen line. He described some snares he'd set and where. He described which roots were edible in late season and where the wild onion grew thickest along the creek banks south of the cabin. She set the journal down and went outside. The wild onion she found within 20 minutes, exactly where Amos set a thick mat of it, along the bank where the creek bent south, still green despite the season, the smell unmistakable when she crushed a leaf between her fingers. She pulled a double handful and ate some raw, standing there at the creek, and the taste was sharp and immediate, and her body received it with a physical gratitude that had nothing to do with pleasure. She brought the rest back to the cabin and set it near the stove. Grouse was the faster option compared to setting and checking snares. She'd watched Silas take grouse with a thrown rock more than once, which she'd always thought was showing off until he'd made her practice it, and she'd understood it was actually about patience, and proximity. Grouse were not intelligent birds, and if you moved slowly enough and didn't alarm them, they would stand at 10 feet and look at you with the blank calm of something that had never learned it needed to be afraid. She went into the timber on the east wall with 2 rounded stones from the creek bed and came back 40 minutes later with 1 grouse, which was not elegant but was real and edible, and she cooked it on the stove with the wild onion and ate every part of it that she could use, including boiling the bones for a thin broth that tasted like nothing much but was warm and had something in it her body needed. She felt better after eating, clearer. She went back to the journal. The Silas connection appeared in an entry from roughly 25 years back, written with more personal detail than most of Amos's entries, the handwriting slightly larger, slightly less careful, as if the memory had loosened something in his usually disciplined control of the page. He and Silas had met during what Amos called a survey expedition, not an official government survey, but a private one, contracted by a land speculator who'd wanted to know what lay in the unmapped country east of the main range. Amos had been hired as clerk and chronicler. Silas had been hired as scout. They'd spent 6 weeks together moving through country that Amos described as magnificent and hostile in equal measure, and they'd become, in the way that people become things in the field when there's no social pretense available, something like genuine friends. The compass had changed hands on the last day of the expedition, in circumstances that Amos described obliquely. There had been an incident Maren read between the lines carefully involving the speculator, whose name Amos did not write, and a dispute over payment and the ownership of the survey data. Silas had intervened in some physical way on Amos's behalf. In the aftermath, Amos had told Silas he owed him, and Silas had said he didn't keep accounts like that, and they'd parted. But in his camp kit that night, Amos had found that Silas had left his compass there deliberately. Amos was certain, not accidentally, because Silas was not a careless man with equipment. No note, just the compass. Amos had written, "I think he left it so that I would have something of his. So I would know someone knew where I was going." A man alone in unmapped country carries more than his pack. Maren read that sentence 3 times. She sat at the table for a while after she finished reading that section, not doing anything in particular, just sitting. Outside the creek was running. The stove ticked. She was in an unmapped ravine with her grandfather's compass and a journal written by a man who had known him and had been known by him, and the distance between those 2 facts, Silas, alive, and on an expedition 25 years ago, and herself sitting here now after everything that had happened since, was the full length of a life compressed into a morning. She didn't let herself stay there long. Sitting, still energy she didn't have to spare, and there was a great deal of work in front of her. The decision she'd made the night before to claim the ravine was not a simple decision in practice. It was a decision with a long series of necessary actions attached to it, each one dependent on the previous, and the first and most important was this: she had to get back to Ash Creek, on foot, with no supplies beyond what she could prepare from the ravine itself, through mountain terrain that had already demonstrated its willingness to be difficult. She spent the morning. She took the rope from the crate and cut out into most of it. She would carry some she used to repair the door hinge so the cabin could be properly secured. She set 4 snares along the rabbit runs. Amos had described, not because she expected to check them before she left, but because if she needed to come back before reaching town, having snares already working was one less thing to do. She wrapped the compass and a selection of the gold coins, not all of it, not most of it, just enough to accomplish what she needed in town in the oilcloth, and tucked the bundle inside her shirt against her skin, where it would stay warm and where the bulk of her body would conceal its outline. She sealed the stone compartment in the hearth as best she could. The facing piece fit back into place, and she packed the edges with the clay soil mixture she'd used on the wall gap, pressing it in with her fingers until it matched the surrounding mortar in appearance. It wouldn't fool a careful eye looking for it, but it would fool an eye that had no reason to look. She banked the stove coals and sealed the damper down to let the heat die slowly rather than going out fast, which would have left the cabin cold-soaked in a way that would take days to reverse. She secured the door. She stood outside for a moment and looked at the ravine in the midday light, the aspen along the creek gone gold, now in the late season, the timber on the walls, dark and serious, the meadow grass bent slightly in a wind that came from the northwest and smelled like elevation and distance. Then she went back through the canyon and started west. She'd taken 3 days coming east in poor condition with failing light and no food. She expected 2 days going back. She knew the route now. She'd eaten, and she'd slept, inadequately but enough. She was still not in what anyone would call good shape, but she was in functional shape, which was the only category that mattered. The first day she made good time through the canyon, and up the drainage and across the shale slope, which was easier going west than east, because she knew exactly where to place her feet. She found the overhang where she'd spent the first night and made camp there again, not because she couldn't have gone further, but because the light was going, and pushing into the dark on that terrain was the kind of decision that felt bold and landed stupid. She ate the last of the cooked grouse she'd wrapped in a piece of cloth from the rotted ticking, drank from the creek, and slept better than she had the previous night because the board platform had, at least, been warmer than granite. The second day was harder. The weather that she'd read in the clouds over the northwestern peak 2 days ago was coming in, not fast, but definitely coming, a pressure drop she could feel in her ears, and the particular way the air smelled before snow at elevation. She moved faster than was comfortable, pushing through the late afternoon when her legs wanted to quit, and came down out of the timber into the lower country above Ash Creek as the first flakes were beginning to come off the clouds. Light flakes, tentative, the beginning of something rather than the middle of it. She had maybe 2 hours before it got serious. She was limping. The seam on her left boot had given up entirely, and the sole was flapping with each step, addressed by tying it closed with a length of the rope which worked imperfectly, but worked. Her feet were wet. Her body was at the outer edge of what it could do without proper food and sleep, and she was aware of this as a fact without being able to do much about it, except keep moving. She walked into Ash Creek as the snow came down in earnest, in the late afternoon of the second day. She looked like what she was, which was a woman who'd been in the mountains alone for 6 days with no supplies. She knew how she looked. She walked past the livery and past the saloon and past the general store. The same man was behind the counter and looked up as she passed the window, and she could see from his expression that he recognized her and was alarmed in the way that people are alarmed when something they'd categorized as resolved turns out not to be, and she went directly to the building that served as the marshal's office. Marshal Thaddeus Crane was at his desk when she pushed the door open, and he looked up from whatever he'd been writing with the practiced calm of a man who had learned not to react visibly to things walking through his door, because the things that walked through a frontier marshal's door were frequently alarming. He was older than she'd expected, mid-50s, gray at the temples, with a broad face that had seen enough weather to have gone to permanent leather, and eyes that were a clear, steady brown that gave nothing away quickly. He looked at her for 3 full seconds without speaking. Then he said, "Sit down before you fall down." She sat. The chair was the most comfortable thing she'd sat on in 6 days, which was not saying much but felt like it was saying everything. "I need to report a crime," she said, "and I need to file a land claim." Crane set down his pen, one thing at a time. "What's your name?" "Maren Hollowell, Silas Hollowell's granddaughter. I was hired by a man named Gideon Rusk to guide a hunting party into the eastern high country. 4 days in, he sent me on a scouting errand and broke camp while I was gone. Took the horses, the supplies, my possessions, and left me above 8,000 feet with nothing. Crane was quiet for a moment. His expression had not changed significantly, but something behind his eyes had sharpened. When did this happen? 6 days ago. I came down on foot through the eastern drainage. He looked at her boots, the rope around the sole of the left one. Her face, which she knew was wind-burned and hollow-cheeked. He looked at all of it without comment, then picked up his pen and said, "Start from the beginning." She told him. Not everything she said, nothing about the ravine or the cabin or the cache, because those were her business, and Crane's jurisdiction over them was a question she hadn't answered yet. She told him about the hire, the trail, the 4 men, what she'd known about Rusk beforehand, the scouting errand, the empty clearing. She told it in order and without editorializing, because she'd found that facts presented clean and in sequence were more convincing than the same facts delivered with emotion, and she needed this man to believe her. When she finished, Crane put his pen down and looked at the notes he'd made. Rusk's party came back through here 3 days ago, he said. Came in fast, resupplied, and moved on toward Callaway. Something tightened in her chest. Not surprise, exactly, but the confirmation of what she'd only understood theoretically before, that Rusk had assumed she was dead and had simply continued his business. Did he say anything about his guide? Said his guide had quit on the trail and gone south. Crane looked at her steadily. Said it as if it were unremarkable. He would, she said. Crane was quiet again. He tapped the pen against the desk twice. I'll need you to write a formal complaint, and I'll need it signed. He paused. Rusk isn't unknown to me. There have been questions about him before, in other territories. Nothing that stuck. He paused again. What was taken from you specifically? She listed it. The rifle which had belonged to Silas, and which she could describe in specific detail, the worn patch on the stock, the replaced front sight, her pack and its contents, the bedroll, the coat, the $4 he'd promised as payment, which she had not yet received. Crane wrote it down. Where are you staying? I don't have lodging. I need to arrange that, and I need to purchase supplies. I have some money. She did not say where the money was or how much. After that, I need to speak to whoever handles land claims in this territory. Crane looked at her again with that steady brown gaze. The land office is Hector Pruitt. He's particular but honest. What land are you claiming? Unmapped country. An unregistered ravine in the eastern drainage, northeast of the canyon mouth on the Hollowell Creek route. She decided to call it Hollowell Creek. It didn't have a name on any map she'd ever seen, so she could call it what she wanted. I need to know if it's already claimed. If it's unmapped and unregistered, it likely isn't. But Pruitt will need a survey description. Crane studied her. You know this country well enough to give one? Yes. He seemed to consider something for a moment. Then he stood up and took his coat from the hook behind the door. I'll walk you to the Dellard. Mrs. Dellard has a room for $1 a week, and she doesn't ask questions. Then you can get a meal and some sleep, and in the morning you can write out the complaint properly and we'll talk about Rusk. She started to say she could manage on her own, and then she looked at her rope-wrapped boot and didn't say it. Thank you, she said instead. The room at the Dellard was small and cold, and the mattress had a dip in the center that was going to be someone's back problem eventually. It was also indoors, with a door that locked and a window that looked onto the street rather than an alley. And when Mrs. Dellard brought up a tray with bread and a bowl of beef broth and a pot of tea, Maren ate all of it so fast. She had to make herself slow down and then sat on the edge of the mattress dip and counted the coins she'd brought from the cache. $22 and some silver. More than she'd had in her possession at any one time in her life. Not a fortune in itself, but enough to pay for the room, purchase the supplies she needed, cover the land filing fee, and have money remaining when she was done. She'd left the larger portion of the cash where it was. She would not touch it again until the land claim was filed, and she understood what she was dealing with. She slept 11 hours. In the morning, she wrote out the complaint against Gideon Rusk in the clearest language she could manage, describing every action in sequence and including the specific items taken. Crane read it carefully, asked 2 questions: what direction had Rusk's camp faced, and had she observed any of the men individually behaving differently than Rusk in the days before, and then signed the complaint himself as witness and told her he would begin making inquiries toward Callaway. This won't be fast, he said. Rusk is mobile, and he's likely to keep moving. I understand that. He may have connections. Rusk isn't poor. I know what he is, she said. Crane looked at her for a moment. You're not worried he'll come back here? No. He thinks I'm dead. Dead people don't file complaints. She paused. But I'd appreciate it if that particular fact didn't circulate widely. Something in Crane's expression shifted the closest thing to a smile she'd seen from him, which was not much of a smile, but was genuine. Understood. She went next to the general store, where the same man with the wax mustache watched her with the uncertain expression of someone revising a previous assessment. She bought flour, dried beans, salt pork coffee, a tin of baking powder, a box of rifle cartridges in the correct caliber, 2 pairs of wool socks, a proper waterproofing compound for boots, a coil of good hemp rope, a hatchet, 2 additional snare sets, a sewing kit, and a wool vest that was men's cut but fit her through the shoulders adequately enough. The total was $9 and some cents. She paid it without negotiating, which she'd considered doing and decided against because she needed goodwill in this town more than she needed to save 60 cents. She also, after a moment at the counter, asked if he knew of a used rifle in good working condition. He did a lever action that had come in on trade, 1 owner, good bore, $22. She looked at it carefully, checked the action, looked down the barrel, worked the lever 3 times to feel the mechanism. 18, she said 20. 18 and a half. He looked at her and then looked at the rifle. 19. Done. She paid $19 and walked out with the rifle over her arm and $7 remaining, which was more money than she'd had when she walked into Ash Creek the first time by $4, and an enormous amount of knowledge. The land office was on the eastern end of the main street, a narrow building with a clerk's window that was closed but had a bell. She rang it. A man appeared mid-40s, wearing eyeglasses on a cord, with the precise, slightly aggrieved manner of someone who handled important paperwork and found most people's relationship with that paperwork inadequate. This was Hector Pruitt. She explained what she needed. He told her that filing a homestead claim on unmapped territory required a survey description, meets and bounds, or a compass survey, or both, and that if the land was genuinely unregistered, she would need to demonstrate both occupancy and intent to improve. She told him she had already begun improvements. He looked at her over his eyeglasses. She described the cabin, the ravine dimensions as best she could estimate them, the creek, the canyon access. Pruitt listened with his hands folded on the counter. When she finished, he said, "The canyon approach you're describing is that the drainage that comes off the eastern face, above the old Tilden trapping route. Possibly, I don't know the Tilden route by name. Nobody does anymore. Tilden died in 71. Pruitt unfolded his hands and opened a large flat drawer under the counter, from which he withdrew a map, a proper surveyor's map, large format, hand-drawn with the careful precision of professional cartography. He laid it flat and oriented it, and then put his finger on a point, roughly where she was describing. The finger pointed to blank space. Not blank in the way of a place that hadn't been interesting enough to map. Blank in the way of a place that genuinely had not been surveyed, a white area, surrounded by notations and contour lines that simply ended at the edges of known country. This area here, Pruitt said. Unregistered, uncharted, and as far as I can determine from the existing records, never homesteaded. That's where I'm filing. He looked at her over his eyeglasses again. She got the impression he was doing what Rusk had done, and the general storeman had done, running the calculation of what she appeared to be versus what she was claiming to be capable of, but Pruitt's version of the calculation seemed to be more genuinely open to revision. You'll need to pay a filing fee of $3 and provide a written survey description, he said. You'll also need to return to the property within 90 days and demonstrate continued occupancy and improvement. If you do that, the claim enters provisional status. Full recognition takes 3 years of continuous occupancy. I understand. The survey description needs to be detailed enough to establish boundaries. He paused. Do you have compass-bearing capability? She set Silas's folding knife on the counter, then reached into her shirt and unwrapped the oilcloth and placed the brass compass beside it. Pruitt looked at the compass. It was clearly not new and clearly functional, the needle settling true north almost immediately. Yes, she said, I have compass capability. She paid the $3 and spent 2 hours working through the survey description as best she could construct it from memory and judgment. The compass bearing of the canyon mouth, the estimated length and width of the ravine, the creek as the eastern boundary, the canyon walls as north and south. It was not a professional survey. Pruitt noted this on the filing document. But it was enough, he told her, to establish the claim's existence pending proper survey, which could be accomplished when conditions permitted. He stamped the filing and handed her a copy. She folded it carefully and put it inside her shirt with the compass and the remaining coins. Walking back toward the Dellard, with the rifle over her arm and the filing document against her chest and $7 in her pocket, she passed the general store, and the man with the wax mustache looked out the window at her, and she noticed, with detached interest, that his expression this time was different from the one she'd received the first day she'd walked into town. He looked like a man recalculating something. She went back to her room and slept another 8 hours. On the third morning, Crane came to the Dellard while she was eating breakfast, actual breakfast, eggs and fried bread and coffee, which she ate with the focused appreciation of someone who had recently known what the absence of it felt like and sat down across from her. "I've had word from Calloway," he said. She looked at him. "Rusk and his party are there. They're not moving fast. Seems like Caldwell has come down sick and they're waiting on him." Crane poured himself coffee from the pot on the table without asking, which she didn't mind. "I've spoken with the Calloway marshal by wire. He's a competent man. He's agreed to hold them pending my arrival." "On what grounds?" "Abandonment of a hired guide in life-threatening conditions is a criminal matter under territorial law. It's not common to prosecute, but it's prosecutable." Crane looked at her steadily. "Also theft of property. The rifle, particularly, that's clear theft. When do you leave?" "Tomorrow morning." He paused. "I can't guarantee what comes back. Rusk may have prepared legal cover." "He's the type he may," she said, but he wasn't expecting a complaint to exist at all. That changes what he prepared for. Crane looked at her for a moment. "You think clearly," he said. "For someone who just walked out of the high country on a rope-soled boot. My grandfather taught me to think clearly, especially then. He said, 'Your thinking gets sloppier the more comfortable you are.'" "Silas Hollowell," Crane said. "It wasn't a question." "You knew him?" "I knew of him. Different territory, but his reputation traveled." He finished his coffee and stood. "I'll be in touch when I'm back." "You planning to stay in Ash Creek?" "For a while. Then I'm going back to my property." She said it the same way she would have said she was going home, because that was what she meant. "I have a cabin to winterize." Crane put on his hat. He paused at the door. "Miss Hollowell. What Rusk did leaving a person like that, I've seen it before. Different country, different version of the same thinking. The thinking that some people are disposable." He stopped, seeming to decide whether to say the next thing. Then he said it. "That thinking is wrong every time, without exception. And it generally leads the thinker somewhere they didn't intend to go." He left. She sat at the table and finished her coffee. Outside the window, Ash Creek was going about its morning, the livery man moving horses, a woman hanging washing on a line that was probably too cold for effective drying. But you worked with what you had. 2 men she didn't know talking outside the saloon with their breath showing in the cold air. An ordinary morning in a place that had not done anything particular for her and had not specifically failed her either. Just a town going about its business with indifferent momentum. She thought about the ravine, about the cabin with its banked stove and its rope-repaired door and its stone hearth with the clay-packed compartment, about the aspen along the creek going gold in the late-season light, about Amos Reddick, who had spent years alone in that place and had left it for someone in genuine need, and who could not have known that the person who eventually found it would carry the knife of a man he had loved like a friend. She thought about what Crane had said, that Rusk's thinking generally led thinkers somewhere they hadn't intended to go. She thought about what that somewhere was going to look like, specifically when Crane came back from Calloway. She was not a woman who gloated. Silas had not raised her for that either. But she allowed herself, sitting there with her second cup of coffee, in a warm room, with a land filing document against her chest, a moment of something that was not gloating, but was its quiet cousin, the deep, factual satisfaction of having survived an attempt on her survival and having come out of it in a position she had not been in before it happened. Gideon Rusk had tried to use the mountain against her. The mountain had given her a home instead. She set down her coffee cup put on her new wool vest, picked up her rifle, and went out to arrange transportation back toward the eastern country because the cabin was not going to winterize itself, and there was a great deal of work still to do before the snow came in earnest. The man who agreed to take her as far as the Eastern Trail Junction was named Burl Haddon, a supply freighter who ran a regular route between Ash Creek and the mining camps northeast of town. He was built like a stump, spoke approximately 12 words per hour, and charged her 50 cents for the ride, which was fair given the weather and the road condition, both of which had deteriorated significantly overnight. She rode on the bench seat beside him with her rifle across her knees and her pack. Betwagon moved through a landscape that had gone from late autumn to early winter between one morning and the next. Most of its windows were dark. The snow that had started the previous evening had laid down 3 inches on the flat and more on the higher ground, and the mountains to the east were white from the timberline up, solid and absolute against a gray sky that wasn't finished with what it had to say. Burl didn't ask where she was going or why. He drove his team with the quiet competence of a man who'd made this road so many times he no longer needed to think about it consciously, and when they reached the trail junction, a crooked pine with an old iron ring hammered into it, the ring rusted to the color of old blood. He stopped the wagon, and she climbed down. "Storm's not done," he said, the most words he'd spoken in 2 hours. "I know. I'll be under timber before it gets bad." He looked at her for a moment with the particular look of a man who has something he's considering saying and then decides not to. He clicked to his horses and drove on. She watched the wagon go, then turned east and started walking. The trail into the timber was harder with snow on it, not impossible, but harder. The footing was uncertain where the snow had covered loose rock. And twice she went through a crust into a hidden depression and came out with a wet boot, which she couldn't afford. Most of its windows were dark. She moved carefully and tried to keep to the denser timber where the canopy had caught most of the snow and left the ground beneath relatively clear, a narrower path, but a more reliable one. It took the better part of 3 hours to reach the canyon mouth, where the walls caught the weather differently, and the interior of the canyon was drier than the open country. She moved through it steadily, her breath making vapor in the cold air, her pack heavier than she liked because of the supplies, but manageable. She'd loaded it deliberately, most of the weight high and centered, the way Silas had taught her, because a badly loaded pack didn't just tire you faster. It changed your balance on uneven terrain, and changed your balance was how you fell. The ravine looked different in snow. The meadow was white, the creek a dark thread through it, the aspen stripped now of their gold leaves and standing bare and silver against the white ground. The cabin was a dark shape at the southern end of the flat, the roof holding a clean inch of snow that had not slid off, which told her the roof was sound enough a leaking roof would have melted from below. She pulled the door open. It dragged worse in the cold, the wood having swollen, and stepped inside. The coals in the stove were cold. The cabin was cold, that deep still cold of an enclosed space that hasn't had warmth in it for days, where the cold isn't drafty but settled, sitting in the walls and floor. She built the fire the same way she'd built the first one, tinder from the birch she'd left. Stacked pence inside, splits, then bigger wood, and while it caught, she laid out her supplies on the table and began thinking about the next 2 weeks. She'd bought enough to be comfortable for 30 days if she managed it carefully, and the ravine would supplement the snares she'd set before leaving, the creek, the grouse in the timber. She was not going to starve, and she was not going to freeze, but those 2 facts required continuous maintenance, not assumption. She spent the next 3 days on the cabin itself. The gaps in the north and east walls she'd packed with clay mixture before leaving held reasonably well, but there were smaller gaps she missed, fine lines where the cold came through as a steady, seeping chill rather than a draft. She mixed more clay from the creek bank freezing work, the clay stiff and resistant, and went around the interior systematically, pressing it into every crack she could find and feel. She replaced 2 roof shingles that had shifted, climbing up on the log wall to reach them, which required more balance than she was comfortable with, and left her hand scraped. She cut and fitted a piece of split log against the base of the north wall on the inside as additional insulation, which was rough work and inexact, but added a meaningful layer against ground cold. The sleeping platform she improved by cutting spruce boughs and layering them thick over the boards, then laying her bedroll over the boughs. The spruce smell was strong and clean, and she didn't mind it. The improvement in sleeping comfort was significant enough that the first night she slept on it, she woke in the morning with a clarity she hadn't had in weeks. On the fourth day, she checked her snares. 3 of the 4 had been tripped, 1 empty. One with a rabbit that had been there long enough that something else had found it first, and she left it, and one with a good-sized rabbit intact. She reset all 4, moved one to a better location she'd identified by the sign along the creek bank, and came back and cooked the rabbit with dried beans and a small amount of the salt pork, which made the cabin smell like something a person actually lived in rather than a place they were merely surviving in. That distinction mattered more than she expected. She found herself in those first days back, talking to the cabin. Not to Amos Reddick, exactly not with any mystical intent, but just narrating what she was doing in a low voice the way you do when you've been alone long enough that the sound of your own voice is company. That board's giving, she'd say, or creek's running higher this morning, or once, pressing clay into a corner gap with her fingers. This would go faster with a second set of hands, Amos. I'll tell you that. She didn't find it embarrassing. Silas had talked to himself in the field. She'd asked him about it once, and he'd said the wilderness was large enough that a human voice was just punctuation. She read more of the journal in the evenings by firelight, working through the later entries she hadn't had time for before. Amos's later writing was more reflective and less practical, less about what he'd done each day, and more about what he thought about what he'd done, the way old men's writing often went, when the body slowed down, but the mind kept moving. He wrote about regret in the careful way of someone who felt it, but refused to be governed by it. He wrote about the army clerk he'd been, and what he'd traded it for, and whether it had been worth it, and concluded, across several entries, that worth was a complicated accounting that he'd probably never fully balance. He wrote once near the end, "A man alone judges himself by his worst days, because there is no one else to judge him by his best ones. This is the penalty and the mercy of solitude both." Maren thought about that for a long time. She was 10 days back in the ravine when Crane came. She heard the horse before she saw it. The canyon carried sound in particular ways, and a shod horse on the canyon floor made a specific ring against the flat rock that was unmistakable. She had her rifle in hand before the horse cleared the canyon mouth, standing in the cabin doorway with the door half open and the morning light behind her. The rider was Crane. He had a second horse on a lead rope, and the second horse was carrying packs, and behind the second horse, wrists tied to the saddle horn with a length of rope, and riding a borrowed-looking bay, was Gideon Rusk. Rusk looked worse than she'd imagined he would. He looked like a man who had spent 2 weeks being wrong about something important, and was only now beginning to understand the dimensions of what he'd miscalculated. His expensive jacket was travel-stained, and his hat was gone, and his pale gray eyes, when they found Maren standing in the cabin doorway with the rifle, did something she'd never seen them do in the 4 days she'd known him on the trail. They went uncertain. She stepped out of the doorway and walked toward them across the snow-covered meadow without hurrying. Crane pulled his horse up 30 feet away. "Miss Hollowell," he said. "Marshall." She looked at Rusk for a moment, then back at Crane. "You found them." Calloway held them as agreed. Caldwell and Pruitt gave statements. Pruitt particularly was forthcoming. "Seems the decision to leave, you didn't sit well with him, and he was glad to tell someone." Crane dismounted, his boots finding the snow with the careful step of a man who'd been in the saddle for a long time. Sherrard ran. "We'll find him eventually." He reached into his coat and produced a bundle wrapped in canvas, which he handed to her. "Your rifle." Pruitt surrendered it without argument. She took it, unwrapped the canvas. It was Silas's rifle, the worn patch on the stock, the replaced front sight, exactly as she'd described it. She turned it over in her hands once, then lowered it. "What happens to him?" she asked, meaning Rusk. "He'll stand charges in Ash Creek. First, the complaint was filed there. The jurisdiction is there. After that, there are 2 other territories with interest in him." Crane glanced at Rusk, then back at Maren. "He's not going to have a pleasant few years." Rusk had been silent through all of this, sitting his horse with his wrists tied and his pale eyes moving between Crane and Maren with a calculation that hadn't entirely left him but had nowhere useful to go now. When Maren looked directly at him, he didn't look away. which she gave him minimal credit for. "You should have died," he said, not with heat, almost with puzzlement, as if this were a genuine mystery he was working through. "I know," she said. "You planned it carefully." "No woman," he stopped. Started again. "This country killed easier people than me," she said. "Yes, I know that too." He looked at the cabin behind her. The stovepipe with its thread of smoke. The door repaired on its hinge. The firewood she'd stacked against the east wall, under the overhang she'd built from split logs and a piece of canvas. His eyes moved over all of it, and she watched him doing the arithmetic, figuring out that she hadn't just survived. She'd built something, and that what she'd built was here and was real and was hers. And she watched the arithmetic arrive at an answer that clearly cost him something to arrive at. He didn't say anything else. Crane took Rux's horse's lead and turned the animals toward the canyon. He looked back at Maren. "Your stolen property inventory minus the coat, which we haven't located, and your pack contents, which, Pruitt says, were distributed or consumed the rifle, is what we could recover with certainty. I'm sorry it's not more." "The rifle's enough," she said. "The charges should result in restitution judgment, if the court agrees. You may see more of what was taken in monetary form eventually." He paused. "The land claim, I had a conversation with Pruitt before I came up here. He said the filing is solid. He also said he has a surveyor coming to the territory in the spring who owes him a favor. Tell Pruitt thank you. Tell him yourself. He seemed genuinely interested in seeing what you've done up here." Crane looked around the ravine, the white flat, the timbered walls, the creek running dark against the snow. "I can see why. I didn't know this existed." "Most people don't," she said. He nodded once, pulled on the lead rope, and started back toward the canyon with Rusk in tow. She watched them go the horses single file through the snow, the canyon walls closing around them until the sound of shod hooves on flat rock faded into the general quiet of the ravine. Then she turned around and went back to work. The winter settled in over the next 3 weeks with the serious, committed weight of mountain weather that has decided it is done making preliminary gestures. The snow came repeatedly and deeply and stayed, and the temperature dropped at night, made the cabinet to the kind of cold that made the cabin walls creak and the creek ice over at its edges, though the center kept running because the current was strong enough. The stove ran continuously, and she managed the fuel supply, carefully burning smaller amounts more consistently rather than building large fires and letting them die, which used wood inefficiently and cycled the cabin through big temperature swings that made everything harder. She learned the cabin's rhythms the way you learn the habits of an animal you live with. The east wall was always coldest, and she kept her water there away from the stove only when she needed it to stay liquid, which stopped being reliable in December. The roof lost one more shingle in a wind event, and she patched it from inside with a piece of canvas and a stick frame because climbing the roof in the conditions wasn't worth the risk. The door continued to be a problem. The leather hinge repaired, dried, and cracked again, and she finally placed it entirely with a coil of the hemp rope threaded through augured holes in the door and the frame, which was inelegant but worked better than anything else she'd tried. She was alone for 61 days. She counted them not in despair, but in inventory the way she counted everything, factually, as information. 61 days of consecutive solitude in a space 18 by 20 feet in winter conditions was a particular human experience that she had not had before and was having now, and was, she found, neither as terrible as it might have sounded nor as easy as she would have liked. The most of its windows were dark, which wasn't the physical difficulty, which was constant and demanding, and in some ways better than idleness, because it gave structure to every hour. The hardest part was the weight of her own thoughts at night, lying on the spruce boughs with the stove ticking down and the wind coming off the mountain above the ravine and the darkness, complete and total outside the walls. She thought about Silas more than she'd expected to. Not with grief. Exactly, grief had had its time in the year after he died, had run its course and left something quieter in its place. More like conversation. She'd find herself working through a problem, how to cut the wood supply to last 3 more weeks, or whether the east wall needed a second clay application, or how to ration the salt pork to best effect, and she'd think about what Silas would have said. Not as hallucination or pretense, but just as a way of accessing a body of knowledge that had been put into her by someone who no longer existed, but whose teaching was entirely real and present. She thought less about Rusk than she would have expected. He appeared in her thoughts occasionally, briefly, and she let him appear and then let him go without spending much time on him. He was a man who had made a calculation, and the calculation had been wrong. She didn't need him to understand that or to feel anything particular about it. His understanding of it was not required for her life to proceed. She thought frequently about the cash. Not about spending it. She'd committed to herself before leaving Ash Creek that she would not make any large decisions about the cash until the land claim was in provisional status, and she had a clearer picture of what she was working with. Money made before you understood your situation was money that often solved the wrong problems. But she thought about what it represented, and about Amos, and about the question of what Asa did when they found themselves in possession of something they hadn't earned in the usual sense. She'd gone back through the journal a second time in December, reading more carefully than she had before. The military payroll origin troubled her less the second time than it had the first. Amos's accounting of it was detailed enough that she understood the fund had been genuinely abandoned, that the men it had been designated for had been documented as discharged and moved on, that there was no identifiable living person to whom it properly belonged. The territorial and federal implications of that were questions she couldn't fully answer herself, and she noted that she needed legal advice eventually, but the moral weight of it seemed, to her careful reading of the facts, lighter than it might have sounded at the outset. The trapping earnings were unambiguously Amos's, and Amos had unambiguously left them for whoever found the place. That portion she accepted without complication. In January, during a stretch of 3 clear days between storms that let the temperature climb above freezing, for the first time in weeks, she walked the full perimeter of the ravine to understand her land better. She took the compass and a piece of birch bark to write on and spent most of one full day moving from one end to the other and up the walls as far as she could manage, taking bearings and estimating distances and writing notes on the bark in the compressed shorthand Silas had taught her. The ravine was larger than she'd first estimated, longer by perhaps a third, and wider at the northern end where the walls stepped back into a wider bowl before closing again at the canyon mouth. There was more timber on the east wall than she could use in a decade. There were 2 additional spring seeps she hadn't found before, both of which ran even in the cold, which meant reliable water in drought years. There was on the north end of the flat, where the ground rose slightly before the canyon, a section of protected south-facing slope that received sun earlier in the day than the rest of the ravine and lost out snow first, the kind of ground that would grow things given the right preparation. Kent Stiffrews. She stood on that slope in the January sun with her coat open because she was warm enough and looked south down the length of the ravine and thought for a long time about what this place could be. Not just a survival location, not just a refuge. What it could actually be if she worked it properly and spent the cash carefully and applied everything Silas had taught her about reading terrain and everything she'd taught herself in the years since about managing on. Less than you needed and working with what you had. The answer she arrived at was not simple. It was the size of a life's work, but it was real and it was hers and it was here. She went back to the cabin and got to work on the spring plans. She was in town in late February when Crane told her the verdict on Rusk. She'd come in for the first time in 2 months, driving a small sledge she'd fashioned from split logs and rope behind a horse she arranged on a credit agreement with the livery. One of the things her documented land claim had accomplished was a small but real credibility with certain business people in Ash Creek who'd revised their accounting of who she was. She needed more flour, more salt coffee, and several specific tools, a proper draw knife, a longer auger, a set of chisels. The kind of tools a person bought when they were planning to build something, not just survive. Crane found her in the general store. Rusks took a plea, he said from the door. 3 years in the territorial prison at Dunmore. Restitution judgment in your favor for the property taken. The court valued it at $41, including the coat. She put down the chisel she'd been examining. 3 years. He had lawyers. They were good ones. Crane came further into the store, his hat in his hand. I'll tell you honestly, I expected worse for him. So did the prosecutor. But the lawyers argued diminished harm since you survived. Diminished harm, she repeated. I know. She looked at the chisel again for a moment. What about Shill looking? He paused. Pruitt was not charged. His testimony was considered full cooperation, and the prosecutor agreed he'd played a lesser role. He's gone back east. She thought about Pruitt, soft, amiable Pruitt, who'd apologized when his horse bumped another horse and had been genuinely uncomfortable with what was being done, and who had still done nothing while it was happening. She didn't know how to feel about him, and decided she didn't need to. $41, she said. They'll send it through Pruitt's office when Rusk's assets are assessed. Could be 6 months. She nodded once and picked up the chisel. Thank you, Marshal, for going to Callaway. That's the job, he said. He put his hat back on. He started for the door, then stopped. Pruitt says the surveyor is coming in April. He'll need someone to guide him up to your property. She looked up. I'd imagine you know the route better than anyone, Crane said. I do, she said. Probably worth being there in person when he does the formal survey. I intend to be, she said. He left. She paid for her tools and her supplies and loaded the slush, and on the way out of town, the general store man whose name she'd learned was Delbert Marsh came to his door and said, Miss Hollowell, Weathers Building Northwest. You want to wait it out? She looked northwest. He was right. There was a cloud formation building over the far peaks that had the specific shape and color of incoming weather. She estimated it at 6 hours out, maybe 8. I'll be under cover before it gets here, she said. He looked uncertain. Road's rough above the junction. I know the road, she said, and clicked to the horse and moved out. She was back in the ravine with the sledge unloaded, and the horse stabled in the lean-to she'd built against the cabin's south wall before the weather came down. She sat on the spruce boughs that night, listening to the wind work itself up into something serious, and she felt the cabin hold against it not perfectly. A whistle at the northeast corner where she needed one more round of clay work, but structurally solid. The log settled and the roof holding, and she felt, without drama, without needing to announce it to anyone, that she was in the right place. Not that the right place was comfortable, not that it was finished or figured out, or without problems. The east still needed work. The east wall still needed work. The lean-to was undersized for a second animal, which she'd need if she was going to do what she was thinking about doing in terms of expanding the operation. The survey would determine her actual boundaries, and might raise questions she hadn't anticipated. The legal status of the cache was still an open question she'd need to address properly at some point. But the right place and the easy place had never been the same thing in her experience, and she'd long since stopped expecting them to be. Spring came to the ravine in the first week of April, not all at once, but in the incremental, grudging way of mountain springs, a degree at a time, a day at a time, the snow pulling back from the south-facing slope first, and then from the meadow, and then from the creek banks until the creek was running high and brown with melt in the ground. Underfoot had that particular softness. That meant it was beginning to think about growing things. The surveyor arrived on April 19th, a lean, quiet man named Aldous Webb, who carried his instruments in a custom wooden case and spoke even less than Burl Haddon the freighter. He was accompanied by Pruitt, who had clearly not been on a horse in some time, and arrived at the ravine looking specifically pained in several joints. Maren met them at the canyon exit. Pruitt looked at the cabin, the lean-to, the woodpile, the snare line she'd strung along the meadow edge, the kitchen garden plot she'd broken ground on in the south-facing section. The soil there was thin but responsive, and she'd worked compost from the creek bank and the latrine pit she'd dug on the west wall into it for 3 weeks. He looked at all of it, with his hands folded behind his back and his eyeglasses slightly fogged from the exertion of the canyon crossing. You've been busy, he said. It needed work, she said. He looked at her for a moment over his eyeglasses, and she had the sense that he was revising something in his assessment of her, not reluctantly, but with the genuine recalibration of a man who was honest enough to update his picture when the facts required it. I'll say it needed work. When I filed this claim, I honestly wasn't certain what I was dealing with. And now he looked around the ravine again. Webb was already setting up his transit at the northern end of the flat, moving with the unhurried precision of someone who had done this 10,000 times and found drama in none of it. Now I think the territory just got a genuine settlement, Pruitt said, which it can use. He paused. The formal survey will take most of today. If its windows were dark, if the boundaries hold with your compass description, and from what I can see, you'll be in full provisional status by the end of the month. 3 years of continuous occupancy from the filing date, and this land is yours in perpetuity. I intend to be here, she said. I believe you, Pruitt said, and she thought he meant it. She spent the survey day working the garden plot, while Webb moved methodically around the ravine taking his readings. And Pruitt sat on a log near the cabin and made notes in a leather folio, and periodically I looked up at the mountains above the ravine walls with the expression of a man who had spent too long in a narrow office and had forgotten that this kind of country existed. At one point, Pruitt called across to her, Miss Hollowell. I had a conversation with a man in town last week who'd heard you were up here. He's interested in hiring a guide for elk season in the fall. I told him I'd pass the information along. She straightened up from the garden. Who is he? A businessman from the East. Legitimate. As far as I can tell, I had Crane look into him. He paused. He's willing to pay $8 for a 10-day trip. $8. She thought about $4. She thought about the distance between those two numbers and what it represented. Tell him I'm available, she said, and tell him to bring proper boots. Pruitt wrote something in his folio. Webb continued his methodical circuit of the ravine. The creek ran high with snowmelt, and the garden soil was dark and soft under her hands, and the mountains above the ravine walls were losing the last of their winter white, the rock emerging gray and honest in the April sun. She went back to work. She had a great deal to do before fall. The businessman from the East was named Harold Fitch, and he arrived in Ash Creek in the third week of September with better boots than she'd expected and worse judgment about mountain weather than she'd feared. He was perhaps 50, broad, through the shoulders, with the confident manner of a man who had been successful enough at enough things that he'd stopped distinguishing between the domains where his confidence was earned and the ones where it wasn't. He shook her hand firmly when they met outside the Dellard Hotel, looked at her with the same calculating pause she'd learned to recognize and wait through, and then said, Pruitt tells me you know the eastern drainage better than anyone in the territory. I do, she said. He also told me he stopped, seemed to decide something. He told me about last year. What Rusk did. She met his eyes without expression. Did that affect your decision to hire me? It's why I hired you, Fitch said. A guide who survived that and came out with a land claim and a cabin has better judgment than any man I could have found. He paused. I hope that doesn't sound condescending. I'm trying to say I've done my research and I'm satisfied. It was an imperfect thing to say, but it was honest, and she'd take honesty over smoothness without hesitation. We leave day after tomorrow, she said. I'll give you a list of what to bring tonight. Trip was 10 days, as contracted, and it was not without friction. Fitch was accustomed to being the most knowledgeable person in any situation he entered, and on the first 2 days he questioned several of her decisions. The route she chose on the second morning, the campsite she selected that afternoon, pace she set on a long uphill stretch that he felt was slower than necessary. She answered each question once clearly with her reasoning. She didn't argue. She didn't soften her answers to make him more comfortable with them. And by the third day, when the route she'd chosen turned out to avoid a section of trail that had washed out in spring melt and would have cost them half a day to navigate around, he stopped questioning and started watching. By the fifth day, he was watching the way a man watches when he's genuinely learning something, not passively, but with the focused attention of someone then who has recalibrated their understanding of what expertise looks like and is now paying different attention than before. He got his elk on the seventh day, a clean shot at 200 yards on a bull she'd spotted from a ridge and tracked for 3 hours across 2 drainages. She helped him dress it without being asked, working fast and precisely in the cold morning air, and when they were done, he sat back on his heels and looked at her with an expression she recognized, not the initial calculating appraisal, but the thing that came after, when the calculation was complete and the result was not what the person had anticipated. You're going to do this professionally, he said. It wasn't quite a question. I already am, she said, wiping her knife on a piece of grass. This is my 3rd paid trip this season. I mean seriously, regularly. As a business, he paused. Have you thought about what that requires? Beyond the guiding itself? She had. She'd thought about very little else through the winter and spring. Tell me what you're thinking, she said, because Fitch was a businessman, and his thinking on this particular subject was probably more current than hers. He talked while they worked on getting the elk loaded, which was considerable physical labor and didn't slow his talking at all. He talked about reputation and word of mouth, and what the Eastern hunting market looked like the wealthy men who came west for trophy hunts, the premium they'd pay for a guide who genuinely knew the country, the difference between a guide who was adequate and one who was exceptional, and how exceptional ones were rare enough that their names traveled. He talked about rates, what the market supported, what she was undercharging by, which was significant. He mentioned 2 outfitting businesses he knew of that had started from a single guide with a good reputation and grown into operations with multiple guides, horses, gear rental, the whole apparatus. She listened carefully and said very little, which was her practice when she was actually learning something. On the last night, before they came down to the trail junction, sitting by the fire, with the temperature below freezing and the sky clear enough to show the full scatter of stars above the ridge, Fitch said, "I'm going to send 3 men to you next fall. Friends of mine. I'll tell them to bring good boots. $8 each," she said. "Same terms. They'll pay 10, he said. "I'll tell them that's the rate, because it should be." She looked at the fire. "I'll take 8 and consider the 2 a founding contribution." He laughed at that, a genuine laugh, surprised out of him. "All right. 8 and a founding contribution." He sobered. "You should know your name is already moving in Ash Creek. Marsh at the general store mentioned you twice in the conversation I had with him when I arrived. Marshall Crane mentioned you. Even Pruitt mentioned you. And Pruitt mentions almost no one." "I know," she said. "Towns are small. It's not gossip. It's reputation. Those are different things." He looked at her across the fire. "The man who left you on that mountain, whatever he thought he was doing, what he actually did was put your name in a story that people tell. And the story doesn't make him look like the capable one." She thought about that for a moment. It was true. She'd noticed it herself over the course of the year. The way people in Ash Creek spoke to her had changed in a gradual, cumulative way that was hard to point to in any single interaction, but was unmistakable in aggregate. Marsh had extended her credit in the spring, without being asked, simply updating his ledger as if it were the obvious thing to do. The liveryman offered her first pick of the available horses when she needed them. 2 ranchers east of town had asked her opinion on trail conditions before running cattle to summer pasture, and she'd given it, and they'd followed it, and come back with their full herd intact. None of it had required her to explain herself. None of it had required her to argue for her own competence. It had simply accumulated, the way things accumulate when the evidence is consistent and the behavior is real. She brought Fitch down to the trail junction the next morning and watched him ride toward Ash Creek, and felt something settle in her not completion, because nothing about a life in progress is complete but momentum. Genuine sense that the thing she was building was taking shape, and that the shape was recognizable now, not just to her, but to the people around her. She turned back toward the mountains. She had one more thing to do before winter, and she'd been putting it off all season, not from fear exactly, but from the same careful instinct that had kept her from touching the bulk of the cash before the land claim was solid. Timing needed to be right. Some things you rushed, and some things you waited on, and knowing the difference was most of what Silas had spent 15 years teaching her. The timing was right. She rode back up to the ravine, stabled the horse, went inside the cabin, and opened the stone compartment. She sat at the table for 2 hours, with everything spread out before her, the coins counted and sorted, the currency bundled and counted, the military payroll register she'd read a dozen times by now, the legal document that she'd spent the winter working through with a law dictionary she'd borrowed from Pruitt, and returned with specific questions that Pruitt had answered as best he could, referring her twice to a territorial attorney named Cass, who operated out of a town called Ridgemont, 3 days east. She'd ridden to Ridgemont in July. Cass was a small, precise woman in her 40s, who wore her hair in a knot so tight it seemed to be keeping her skull assembled, and who had the kind of legal mind that moved through complexity the way water moved through rock, finding the path not by force, but by persistent, accurate pressure. Maren had laid the situation before her as clearly as she could, omitting nothing material. Cass had listened and then asked without interrupting, and then asked 9 questions, 6 of which Maren could answer immediately, and 3 of which required her to go back to the journal and check. They'd met again 2 weeks later. The military fund, Cass had said, is the most complex element. The others are straightforward. The trapping earnings are a clear bequest. The personal effects, including the compass, were entrusted property, and Reddick's explicit written instruction constitutes a valid informal will under territorial law, which I can document properly. She'd looked over her papers. The military component, the original fund, is old enough and documented as abandoned by the Army's own records thoroughly enough that direct claim by the federal government is extremely unlikely. There is precedent in 2 territorial cases for civilian discovery claims on abandoned military property. She'd paused. I won't tell you there's no risk. I'll tell you the risk is manageable with proper documentation and a transparent accounting. What does transparent accounting look like? Maren had asked. It looks like what you're already doing. A written record of the discovery, the circumstances, Reddick's documentation, the chain of custody, a formal legal inventory, potentially a notification to the nearest military administrative office, not a surrender, a notification which establishes good faith and typically concludes the matter for funds of this age and size. Maren had retained Cass for the documentation work and paid her from the trapping portion of the cash. Cass had noted, was the appropriate portion to use. The notification to the military administrative office in Callaway had gone out in August. The response which Cass had told her to expect and which had arrived in Pruitt's office in September was a form letter acknowledging receipt of the notification, classifying the fund as a documented abandoned disbursement, and formally releasing any government interest in it. The letter had taken 11 words to do something that had worried Maren for the better part of a year. She'd read it 4 times to make sure she understood it correctly, and then she'd folded it and put it with Cass's documentation in the flat box from the hearth, and the weight she'd been carrying since the night she'd first opened that box and found the compass had shifted, not disappeared, but shifted into something she could carry differently. Now she sat at the table and did the final accounting. The total, when she finished counting and cross-referencing against Cass's legal inventory, was larger than she'd allowed herself to think about directly until this moment. Not extravagantly large in the way of great fortunes, but large in the way that mattered, practically large enough to make fundamental decisions from rather than merely reactive ones. Large enough to change not just her immediate circumstances, but the structure of what was possible. She sat with that for a while. Then she got a piece of paper and her pen and began writing a list. The list was not a wish list. It was an investment list, and there was a difference that Silas had been particular about the difference between wanting and planning, between spending on things that felt good and spending on things that built capacity. She'd watched people with sudden money get it wrong. In both directions, spend it all fast on comfort and have nothing left when the comfort ran out, or hold it so tight in fear of losing it that it sat unused while the opportunities it could have created walked past. Neither extreme was wisdom. Both were fear wearing different costumes. She needed 2 good horses, not cheap ones horses that would hold up over years of hard mountain work. She needed proper tack, not the borrowed and pieced-together collection she'd been managing with. She needed a second sleeping structure because the cabin was adequate for herself but could not accommodate a client or an assistant, which she'd need eventually. She needed livestock goats, initially, for the milk and the land management, and eventually cattle if the South Meadow could be developed to support them. She needed tools, proper carpentry tools, a full set, because she'd been improvising with a limited kit all year, and it was costing her time and quality both. She needed to address the garden properly, proper seeds, proper soil amendment, the fencing that would keep the deer out, which she'd been meaning to build since April. She wrote it all down. Then she assigned rough costs to each item based on the Ash Creek market prices she'd memorized from months of careful attention. Then she prioritized by what built on what the horses first, because without reliable horses, the guiding business was limited in what it could offer, and the guiding business was the engine everything else ran on. The number she arrived at for the first year's investment was significant, but not reckless. It left a substantial reserve untouched, which was not fear, but sense the mountains were unpredictable, and a person who spent to the edge of their reserve in good conditions had nothing when the bad conditions came, and in this country, the bad conditions always came eventually. She folded the list and put it in her pocket and returned the cash and coins to the compartment. She fitted the stone facing back and packed the edges. She'd need to find a better solution, eventually a proper strongbox, properly secured, which she'd ask Cass about on her next visit to Ridgemont. But for now the hearth held it, and the hearth was solid, and the ravine was hers, and no one else knew it was here. She went outside and stood in the September evening and looked at her land. 4 months ago it had been a white flat with a dark stream threading it and a repaired cabin at the south end. Now it was something different. The garden plot on the south-facing slope had produced not abundantly, because the first year of a new garden rarely produced abundantly, but genuinely. She'd put up dried beans and dried herbs and 3 kinds of root vegetables in the coal storage pit she'd dug into the north wall's exterior. And what was in there would supplement her winter stores meaningfully. The lean-to had been extended and properly roofed in August, and could now accommodate 2 horses comfortably. The cabin's east wall had its second clay application, and a piece of buffalo hide stretched over the interior face, which had transformed that wall from the cold problem it had been all winter into something merely cool. The roof was sound web. The surveyor had looked at it in April and said it would hold another 10 years with modest maintenance, which she'd been doing. The snare lines were running well. The creek was down from its spring height, but still full. The timber on the walls was standing the same as it always stood, indifferent and renewable and vast. She'd done this. With her hands and her judgment, and the knowledge Silas had put into her over 15 years, and with Amos Reddick's extraordinary act of trust toward a stranger in genuine need, she had taken a place that was a clearing in the dark and made it a home. She was 23 years old. The thought arrived with a kind of surprise that almost made her laugh. She'd felt, at various points in the past year, anywhere between 35 and ancient, and occasionally briefly, in moments of particular physical exhaustion or when something she'd built failed and had to be done considerably older than that. But 23 was the actual number. She had, statistically speaking, a great deal of time in front of her. She went inside and made coffee and sat at the table with Amos's journal open in front of her, not reading it, but just having it there, the way you keep something near that has mattered to you. The following morning she rode down to Ash Creek. The ride of its windows were dark. Ride had become familiar enough that she no longer thought consciously about the route. Her body knew where the trail bent and where the footing changed and where the slope required a different rhythm from the horse. She arrived in the early afternoon and went first to Pruitt's office, where she paid for the survey's final completion cost and picked up the formal survey document that Webb had filed. She read it in Pruitt's office, standing at his counter, and when she'd finished she folded it and put it in her coat. Full provisional status as of October 1st, Pruitt said, looking at his ledger. 3 years from the original filing date. You'll need to be present for the final review, but given the documentation and the continuous occupancy record you've maintained, I don't anticipate complications. I'll be there, she said. She went to Marsh's general store and bought what she needed: supplies, hardware, a specific type of waterproofing compound for leather that she'd been looking for since spring and which Marsh had finally sourced for her, apparently making a note of it after she'd asked twice. He carried it out to her horse for her without being asked, which was a small thing and which she noticed interest without commenting on. Then she went to the livery because there was a horse she'd been watching for 3 weeks. The livery's windows were dark. The liveryman's name was Gus Fielder, and he was one of the better judges of horses she'd encountered outside of men who did nothing else. The horse she'd been watching was a gray mare, 5 years old, well built through the hindquarters and with the kind of feet you wanted. On mountain terrain, wide, tough, with good frog development that told you the horse had been worked on hard ground. She'd watched the mare move across the corral a dozen times and seen no irregularity in any direction. How much for the gray, she said. Gus told her. She looked at him. He revised the number downward. She looked at him again. He revised it downward a second time, with the expression of a man who has reached the point where revision is painful, but recognizes a fair fight when he's in one. She paid him and arranged to collect the mare in 2 days, which would give her time to organize the additional tack she'd need. Walking out of the livery with the receipt in her hand, she ran into Crane. He was coming from the direction of the marshal's office with his coat on and his hat against the wind, walking with the deliberate pace of a man who was going somewhere specific and wasn't in a hurry about it. He stopped when he saw her. Miss Hollowell. You're in town. Buying a horse, she said. The gray mare, he said immediately. which told her he'd been watching the same horse. Good choice. I know, she paused. Any word on Sherrod? He turned up in a mining camp in Nevada Territory 3 weeks ago. Crane's expression was composed, but not without a particular quality in it. He's been charged there. On a separate matter, seems he's been busy since leaving here. He'll stand charges in 2 territories. I don't expect he'll be a free man before he's 50. She absorbed that. And Rusk? He's at Dunmore? He is. 14 months and now 19 to go. Crane paused. I received a letter from the prison administrator last month. Apparently Rusk has been requesting information about the outcome of the land claim. He wanted to know whether you'd been awarded the property. She looked at Crane. What did the administrator tell him? He told him it wasn't information the prison was obligated to provide. Crane looked at her steadily. But I imagine Rusk's lawyers have told him by now. She thought about Rusk sitting in a prison in Dunmore, knowing that the woman he'd left to die in the mountains had instead filed a land claim, survived a winter alone, guided 3 hunting parties, purchased a horse, and was standing in Ash Creek in the October sun discussing it with the marshal while Rusk counted months off a 3-year sentence. She thought about that very specifically, and then she set it aside. He doesn't need to know anything about my land, she said. What happens on my property is my business. Agreed, Crane said. He walked with her toward the Dellard, where she'd take a room for the night. It was a habit they'd developed over the year without discussing it. When she was in town, they often walked a section of the main street together in the late afternoon, not with any social agenda, but just in the natural way of 2 people who had mutual respect and overlapping concerns and found each other's company reasonable. 3 parties this fall, he asked. Fitch in September. 2 others in October, a rancher from the South Territory, and a man Fitch sent up who came from back east. She paused. The eastern man paid $10 without being asked. Crane glanced at her. Your rate's changing. The rate is what it needs to be, she said. I'll set it based on what the work is worth, not what I think people will agree to without arguing. That's what Silas would have said, Crane said, and she thought that was probably the highest compliment he was capable of giving. Stated in exactly the way Crane would state it factually, without embellishment. She thought about Silas often now in a different way than she had during the winter. The winter grief, which had been less about fresh loss and more about accumulated loss, the homestead and Silas, and everything that the homestead's loss had carried with it, had clarified over the spring and summer into something quieter and more permanent. She missed him with the specific, patient ache of missing someone you loved who taught you things that turned out to matter more than you'd understood when you were learning them. The teachings were so thoroughly inside her now that she couldn't always tell where Silas ended and she began, and she'd stop trying to separate them because the separation wasn't real. She'd tried once, lying awake in January, to imagine what it would have looked like if Silas had lived, if the homestead hadn't been taken, if she'd still been there, working the land she'd grown up on, in the life that had been foreclosed. And she'd found this surprised her that the imagined alternative wasn't better than what she had now. It was different. It was the version without the loss and the abandonment, and the mountain and the cold and the 61 days alone. But it also wasn't the version where she stood on a south-facing slope on land that was hers by claim and survival, and 4 years of hard work, knowing every inch of an unmapped ravine that no map had ever shown, and knew that she had made that place what it was. She didn't conclude from this that suffering was good or that Rusk had done her a favor. He hadn't. What he'd done was wrong, and she'd thought it was wrong when he was doing it, and she thought it was wrong now. But wrong things, when you didn't die from them, could deposit you somewhere you needed to be. She hadn't needed the wrong thing to happen, but here she was. After dinner, she sat in her room at the Dellard and wrote a letter to Cass in Ridgemont, outlining what she needed next in terms of the legal documentation of the cache's final accounting and a proper strongbox arrangement. She wrote clearly and specifically the way she'd learned to write anything important: no hedging, no filler, no apology for the space the request took up. Cass had mentioned on their second meeting that Maren was one of the more clearly communicating clients she'd had, and Maren had filed that information away as useful, not as flattery, but as a tool she apparently had that she should continue using. She also wrote a shorter letter to the 3 men Fitch. Had promised for next fall, introducing herself and outlining the trip tip terms and the rate, which she'd set at $10 per man for 10 days. She worded it without qualification, without excessive explanation, without the tentative framing she'd heard other people use when they were uncertain of their own authority. She wrote it the way she'd write any business communication, clear about what she offered, clear about the terms, inviting them to confirm their interest. She sealed both letters and left them for the morning post. In the morning, she collected the mare, whom she decided to call Compass, not sentimentally, or not only sentimentally, but because the mare had true direction in her, that quality of knowing what she was doing and committing to it, which Maren had noticed in the corral, and which confirmed itself the first half-mile out of Ash Creek. The mare moved on the trail with a settled, even confidence that reminded her of the best quality in the best animals she'd known, not flashy, not fast, just completely and reliably present. The ride back to the ravine took longer with the new mare and the additional supplies. And they came through the canyon in the early afternoon, with the light coming flat and golden off the sandstone walls. Most of it were dark, and the ravine opened up before the way it always did, sudden and complete, the whole of it visible from the canyon exit. And she stopped the horses a moment and looked at it. 4 years from now, when the final recognition came through, this would be hers on paper, as completely as it was hers in reality. It already was hers in reality. The paper would simply confirm what was already true, which was often what legal documents did. They confirmed rather than created, ratified rather than originated. The creation and the origin were always prior to the document in the work and the survival and the commitment to stay. She rode down into the flat and stabled both horses in the expanded lean-to and unloaded the supplies and stacked the firewood from the supply run she'd done before this trip into the stack against the east wall, which was getting to a satisfying height. She could look at that stack and calculate winter in it, how many weeks it represented, how it measured against the previous year's consumption, where it would need supplementing. That evening, with the stove burning and the horses settled, and the supplies stacked, and the new tack hung properly on the pegs she'd added to the lean-to wall, she sat at the table with Amos's journal and with Silas's knife beside it, and with the brass compass open beside the knife. The needle settled north, and she read the final pages of the journal again. She'd read them many times by now. She knew them almost by memory. But she read them again because some things bear rereading, not because you've forgotten them, but because what they mean to you changes slightly each time. The way light on a landscape changes with the angle of the season. I hope whoever finds the cabin will be someone decent, someone in genuine need, because in my experience, genuine need and genuine character often come together in ways that comfort prevents. She'd not been decent because she was in need. She'd been decent because Silas had tried to raise to be, and because she'd chosen to maintain that through circumstances that had given her reason to be otherwise. But Amos wasn't entirely wrong about the connection. Most of its windows were dark. There was something about being stripped to essentials, about having the comfortable buffer between yourself and your own character removed that clarified things. Rusk had been comfortable. Comfort had let him not examine what he was doing closely enough to see it clearly. Maren had been given no such buffer. She'd had to know exactly what she was and what she was doing every single day, because there was no safety margin in which sloppiness could live undetected. She thought about what it had cost her to get here, not in money or physical suffering, though those were real, but in the quieter currency of what she'd had to understand about people, about the way Rusk had looked at her, and the way the general store man had looked at her, and the way most people had been looking at her, most of her life. That running calculation about what someone like her could or couldn't do, what she was or wasn't likely to be capable of. She'd been carrying the weight of other people's low expectations her entire life, not buckling under them, but carrying them the way you carry something on a long trail, aware of the weight constantly, managing it, compensating for it, never fully free of it. What the year had given her, among other things, was something she hadn't expected. She'd stopped carrying it. Not because the people around her had all stopped having those low expectations. Some still did, and some always would. And she'd stopped expecting that to change universally because she wasn't 20 years old, and she understood something now about how people worked that she hadn't understood fully when she was younger. What changed was not everyone else's expectation. What changed was that she'd stopped organizing her existence around the weight of it. It was there, it was someone else's weight, not hers. She put it down and walked at her actual pace, and that was the end of it. The compass needle settled north. She closed the journal and set her hand flat on the cover for a moment, the way you might put your hand on a shoulder in brief acknowledgement, and then she got up and checked the stove and went to bed. She was asleep before the fire had burned down to coals. Over the following 3 years, the guiding business grew in the straightforward way of things, built on solid foundations, not explosively, not in the way of stories that needed drama to be interesting, but steadily and by merit, one trip and one reputation at a time. Fitch's 3 men came in the fall of the second year and left with exactly the elk they'd hoped for, and the specific experience of realizing their guide had known 3 separate times during the trip what the weather was going to do before it did. And they told people about this when they went home. Those people told other people. By the 3rd year, she had more requests for fall season than she had days to accommodate, and was turning away parties, which was both a good problem and a genuine logistical constraint she needed to address. She addressed it, the way she addressed most practical problems, by sitting with it long enough to understand it properly before doing anything about it. What she needed was not more of herself. You couldn't manufacture that. What she needed was a second guide, someone she could trust with clients in countries she knew, someone she could train properly, and whose judgment she could vouch for. She spent the better part of a season thinking about who that person might be before she found him. His name was Tobias Reed, and he'd shown up in Ash Creek as a wrangler for a ranching operation east of town that had subsequently gone under when the owner died without a will, and the estate became complicated. Tobias was 26, lean and weathered and quiet, in the way of someone who'd spent time in the mountains rather than just near them, and she'd first noticed him at the livery, where he'd been reshoeing his own horse, not having the liveryman do it. Doing it himself, which told her something, and where he'd caught a lead rope in midair when her gray mare had gotten loose from the hitching post, catching it cleanly and handing it back without making it into anything, just handing it back and going back to what he was doing. Small thing. But small things told you. She offered him work in early spring of the 4th year. He looked at her with a careful expression that she recognized as the expression of a person doing genuine assessment, rather than the reflexive skepticism of someone who'd already decided. He asked 3 questions: what the pay structure was, what he'd be expected to handle on his own, and what the protocols were if something went wrong in the field. Good questions. All 3 practical, all 3 the right ones. She hired him, and spent 2 full months taking him through every inch of the country she used, before she put him with a client alone, and he was exactly what the small things had suggested. He might be careful, patient, genuinely competent, and honest about what he didn't know, which was the most important quality and the hardest to teach because it had to already be there. The fall season of the 4th year ran 11 parties through her operation. 7 were hers, 4 were Tobias's. Every one of them came back with what they'd come for, or close to it, and without any incident that couldn't have been expected in mountain country. Tobias took a party through a route she'd shown him in May, and managed a sudden early snowstorm on the 3rd day, with exactly the judgment she'd have hoped for, found shelter early, kept the clients calm, waited it out, pushed through on the 4th day when the window opened. The clients came down talking about it as a highlight, rather than a problem, which was either good luck or good management, and Maren suspected it was 60% the latter. She paid him fairly and told him so plainly when she did it, which was something she'd decided to do from the beginning, not to obscure the pay structure or make him feel the money was a gift. It wasn't a gift. It was the honest market value of reliable work done well in difficult conditions. At the end of that season, she sat at her table with the season's accounting laid out before her and understood that the thing she'd been building was now genuinely built. Not finished, nothing going, was ever finished but established. Real, operating on its own principles with enough structure to be more than just herself running on nerve. The land claim reached its final recognition on a Tuesday in November of the 4th year. Most of its windows were dark. 2 weeks before the anniversary of the day, she'd first walked into Pruitt's office with rope around her boot and $11 worth of her grandfather's stubborn influence in her shirt. Pruitt had sent word down through Burl Haddon, who was still running his freight route and still charging fair rates, and still speaking approximately 12 words per hour. The word was simply, come in and sign. She rode Compass into Ash Creek on a clear, cold morning, with the mountains white above the timberline and the sky the particular hard blue of high autumn in the territory, and she tied up outside the land office and went in. Pruitt had the document on the counter. It was a proper legal instrument, stamped and witnessed, 3 pages of territorial language that said in 3 pages what could have been said in 1 sentence: "This land is yours." She read all 3 pages anyway. Then she signed it. Pruitt handed her a copy and kept one for the record. He extended his hand across the counter, a formality he did not generally perform. She understood and she shook it. "Congratulations, Miss Hollowell," he said, in the careful way of a man who meant the word genuinely, but was practiced in understatement. "I've processed a fair number of these over the years. I can tell you this one is unusual." "How so?" she asked, though she had a sense of the answer. "Most people who file a homestead claim have already identified the land before they arrive in this office," he said. "They've surveyed, or had it surveyed, or they're claiming something that's been worked by a family before them. You walked in here with a rope around your boot and a compass that had belonged to your grandfather, and described a piece of land you'd found on foot, alone, in bad weather, 6 days after being abandoned in the high country." He paused. "I've never processed a claim that started from quite those specific circumstances. It was the only piece available," she said. "That," Pruitt said, "is one way to look at it." She walked out of the land office with the document under her arm and stood on the wooden sidewalk for a moment in the November sun. Down the street, Marsh was arranging something in the window of the general store. The livery was operating, the sound of horses and the smell of hay drifting on the cold air. 2 women she knew slightly by sight were walking with their heads bent in conversation on the other sides of the street. A normal Tuesday in a small frontier town, unremarkable in every direction. She folded the document carefully and put it inside her coat. Crane was crossing the street toward her from the direction of his office. He'd seen her come in. He had the habit of noticing arrivals and departures, which was partly the marshal's occupational attention, and partly just who he was. "Final recognition," he said yes. He nodded once. Not elaborately. Just nodded. "Good," he said, and meant it in the specific way of a man who had watched a long process conclude correctly and found satisfaction in that rather than in the telling of it. "I appreciate everything you did," she said. "At the beginning, especially. Coming to the Dellard, the walk to the marshal's office." She paused. "You didn't have to take the complaint seriously." "Yes, I did," he said simply. "That's what the complaint is for." She thought about that for a moment. "Rusk is out in 5 months. I know. He's not going to come here." "No," Crane agreed. "He's not." He paused. "Men like Rusk, when their calculation fails that completely, they don't retry it. They find a different kind of calculation. He'll go somewhere else and try something else." He looked at her with his steady brown eyes. "He spent 3 years knowing you survived. I think that's done more work in him than any sentence could." She wasn't sure she agreed with that completely, but she understood what Crane meant, and she let it stand. Rusk had attempted to erase her from a situation, and instead she'd become a named entity in the territory, a guide with a reputation and a land claim, and a second guide working for her and 11 parties, worth of satisfied clients who'd told other people. Whatever Rusk had intended, the outcome was the opposite of erasure. She rode back toward the ravine in the early afternoon, with the document against her chest and compass moving at a steady walk on the familiar trail, and she thought about the path from $11 and a borrowed coat to this particular Tuesday, and what, if she were honest about it, she had actually learned. She'd learned that patience was a form of courage. Not passive, not resigned, but active, the choice to work steadily in the direction of what you'd decided, rather than reacting to every obstacle as if it were terminal. Rusk had moved fast and collapsed fast. Amos Reddick had moved slowly and built something that lasted 30 years and reached her across decades. Silas had never hurried a decision in the field and had never failed to make one when it was needed. Speed wasn't the virtue. The judgment about when to hold and when to move, that was the virtue. She'd learned that the people who dismissed her had consistently underestimated one specific thing, not her strength, not her endurance, not her knowledge, but her patience. Her willingness to absorb the dismissal and continue anyway, not with the martyred persistence of someone proving a point, but with the practical orientation of someone who had better things to do than argue about it. She couldn't prove anything by talking. She could prove things by doing them, so she did them. She'd learned that home was not a thing you were given or born into necessarily. Sometimes it was, and that was the easy version. But sometimes home was a thing you found in the dark, by following the sound of water through a canyon mouth, and recognized not because it looked like what you'd expected, but because something in you settled when you arrived in it. She came through the canyon as the afternoon light was beginning to go long, the ravine walls casting their particular slanted shadows across the flat, and the meadow was brown with the deep autumn, and the creek was running low and cold and clear, and the cabin at the south end was exactly what it was: not grand, not finished, always needing something, and the smoke from the banked stove was a thin thread rising in the still air. Tobias had the horses settled by the time she arrived. He was stacking firewood by the lean-to, and he looked up when she came through the canyon and raised a hand in the brief acknowledgement that was their standard greeting, and she raised hers back. She stabled Compass, gave her water and a measure of grain, checked her feet habit, always the feet first, and then went inside. She hung her coat on the peg near the door, the one that had always been there, hammered into the log wall by Amos Reddick decades before she'd arrived. She put the land document on the table flat and set Silas's knife beside it. The bone handle was worn smooth from years of use, the blade kept sharp from the same discipline. She set the brass compass beside the knife, open, the needle finding north the way it always did, steady and unambiguous. The three objects on the table: the knife that Silas had given her, that had taken mortar apart and cut tinder and dressed game and loosened a stone compartment that changed everything. The compass that Silas had given Amos, that Amos had kept for 25 years, that had told her whose story she'd wandered into and why it mattered. The document that said the land was hers. She sat down and looked at all three of them for a while, the fire in the stove throwing its familiar heat, the creek audible through the walls, the horses settled in the lean-to with the sound of their breathing and their occasional movement, and the mountains above the ravine going into the blue early dark of November, with the complete indifference to human story that was she had come to understand, not coldness, but honesty. The mountains didn't care about her. They didn't care about Rusk or Amos or Silas or what any of them had done or suffered or built. They were just themselves: the terrain, the weather, the cold, spring, the water running where it ran, the timber standing where it stood. That was, she thought, exactly what made them fair. They applied the same conditions to everyone. What you brought to them was your own. What you came out with was the answer to who you actually were, not who you'd been told you were or who someone else had decided you were for the convenience of their own narrative. Gideon Rusk had brought his assumptions into this country, and the country had returned them to him with interest. Maren Hollowell had brought $11 and a knife and 61 days of everything Silas had put into her. The country had given her back exactly what she'd brought. Outside, the first stars were coming into the cold sky above the ravine walls. The same stars Amos had watched from this same ground for 30 years. The same stars Silas had navigated by. The same stars that didn't know any of their names and never would. She got up and fed the stove another log, and the fire took it, and the cabin stayed warm.